Before we talk about this idea of something called percent of change, let's just talk about percents in general. A percent is a part to whole ratio, but in this part to whole ratio we have a specific whole, which is 100. Let's take a look at this example. According to the Office of Management and Budget, in 1970 the U.S. government spent $82 billion for defense at a time when the federal budget was $196 billion. 37 years later, in 2007, spending for defense was $495 billion and the budget was $2,472 billion. What percent of the federal budget was spent for defense in 1970 and then in 2007? We're asked to find a percent, okay? There's a lot of information in this problem. One of the best things to do in a word problem is to look at what the question is. The question is what percent? And it's the percent spent for defense. So the idea of a percent is that it is a part to whole ratio. So in 1970, we're looking for the part spent on defense, which was $82 billion, and the whole is the total federal budget, which was $196. However, this does not answer the question because it wanted it as a percent. So to give it as a percent, we can simply just convert this fraction. First thing would be to convert it to a decimal, which gives us 0.4184. And then converting that decimal to a fraction gives us 41.8%, or if you'd like to call it 42%, that's fine. In 2007, if we want the percent spent on defense, we're going to look for the part that was spent on defense and write it in ratio with the whole, which would be the total budget for that year. But again, the question wanted it as a percent, so we need to convert it to a percent. Starting out by taking numerator divided by denominator gives us the decimal form, and then multiplying this by 100 or moving the decimal point 2 places over to the right, we then tack on the percent sign and get our roughly 20%. Now sometimes we want to look at something called the percent of change. So we want to look at the change as a percent. Now be careful because you might be tempted to say, oh, well, the percent of change is the difference between 1970 spending and 2007. So it looks like there was a 22% decrease. Think about the problem with making that statement though. The 42% came based on this whole amount, and the 20% came based on this whole amount. So you cannot compare these percentages because they were out of a different total. So we can't ever really just look at the percentages, the end percentages. Instead, we look at this thing called percent of change. In other words, what we're going to do is look at the actual change first. So how much money what was the difference in spending over those two time periods? And then, because a percent is a part out of a whole, we need to compare it to some whole. Well, the whole we always choose to compare to is the base or original amount. So if you look at this formula, if we're looking for something called percent of change, to actually calculate a change, we look at a difference. So we look at the difference between what was currently being spent in this example and what was previously spent, say in 1970. That will give us our part. That gives us the change. To express that change as a percent, we need to put it out of a whole, but the whole we always choose is to compare it to the base amount. So in this example, if we want the percent of change, I always like to start out with my formula. Percent of change is new minus base all over base. In this case, we're solving for the percent of change. The new amount, if it's in terms of times, it will be the most current time. So 2007 is the most recent, so the new amount is the 495. The base amount will always be the earliest, so 1970 is earlier, so that base amount was 82, and we're going to compare it to the 82. Now when I take 495 minus 82, I get 413 all over 82. It wants a percent of change. So first I'll go to the decimal form. Now this is not a percent, this is strictly decimal form. If I want the percent form, I have to move that decimal point 2 places to the right and tack on the percent sign. So there was actually a 503% of change from the spending on defense from 1970 to 2007. In the next video, we're going to look at a couple more examples involving percent of change. If you look at your formula packets, the very first formula for consumer math on that page is your percent of change formula. So you do have it. There is no need to memorize it. It's just a matter of applying it, which we will look at in the very next video.